Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Julian Midville. I'm the chair of the Transportation Advisory Board. And I'm calling the December 4th meeting to order at 6:09 p.m. We're going to get started with approval of the minutes. I think prior to the previous discussions, we wanted to talk about this one. But Cynthia, you had something to say?
I had a comment about, thank you, Julian. I'm not sure, I know there's always a lot lost when it gets summarized, but I was not comfortable with the characterization that our issue, this is a regular business A, the draft central Issaquah station area visioning and guiding principles. There's a description of the central issue that we discussed around the parking garage and the land use around when you put big parking garages in a transportation area. And it was described as a concern about charm. And I don't remember us ever using the word charm, and whether we use the word charm, I don't think that was our point. It's a charm is pretty, well, it's loaded in some ways. It's not very specific. It's not really very descriptive. It's really it's a land use. It's an issue around, car dependency. It's not really about charm. So I was hoping we could take another crack at that. And I didn't go back and listen to exactly what words we did use, but I'm pretty sure we did not describe it as a problem with charm. It's really a land use, a density, a compact walkability, transitory and development, all those things that we're concerned about having a big parking. And I feel like it's a really, really, really important issue around the light rail generally. And so I think it's really important we take the time to describe the conflict really carefully, and calling the conflict, simplifying it by just saying it's a concern between parking spots and charm wasn't what we said. And the only reason it matters is because I think this is a really important issue around this project. So I think we'll continue to disagree about what the right answer is, but I think we should take a lot of care to describe the problem. So that's my comment.
So we think. And then another point I had in particular, just a little typo with Chris Ray. It's his last name is misspelled. Oops. And so just another grammatical note. But yeah, I think if there's no opposition, I think it would be good to revisit this in our January meeting with the workshop language. And we can take a look at that in our team meeting. Cool. Okay. With that, we'll move on and take a look at those in January. Is there anyone online? There's not. And then with that, we will get started with our regular business. First with the Squak Non-Motorized Improvement Plan discussion.
See it. Good. Good evening. My name is John Friend, Transportation Program Coordinator, joined this evening by my future coworkers, Brent Powell and Janessa Donato. So,
Congrats.
thank you.
Yeah.
Are
you going to be working on this project?
Talk to him.
Do we get to see it? Yeah. Sorry.
So yeah, we're talking about Squak Mountain Non-Motorized Improvement Plan. So this evening, the purpose is to share the results of the most recent public outreach phase, which started with discussion here at TAB, and then receive feedback from TAB on the proposed and preferred alternative. We already went through this before, but very quickly, background on this project is it was first mentioned in the 2015 walk and roll action strategy, just included on a list of hypothetical projects. When the MMP was created in 2021, it was included in a planned list, and then the MMP also established sidewalk standards for collectors, which includes at least a sidewalk on one side of the street. And then the next year, the TIP included in the future projects list, and then council specifically grabbed it and said, we would like to put this into the TIP. Just a review of bicycle level of traffic stress at the city here. Our goal is to have it LTS 1, 2, or 3, 4 being that really, strong and fearless category with the minimum, hopefully, LTS of 3. And then I think from here, I'll hand it over to the team.
Sure. So this is a map of the study location. It hasn't changed since the last time we chatted with you about the project. We're working in between the boundaries of existing sidewalk segments that are out there in this corridor. And, for all purposes today, we'll just kind of describe it as the corridor, even though there are a couple different streets in here, 12th Avenue and Adamus Drive, forming this continuous route. So our southern limit here is Furwood Boulevard, Mount Markham Place, southern limit, Furwood Boulevard, our northern limit. And we are very close to the park as well, as you can see on that map. And then on the next couple of slides, we'll share just the overview of the study schedule that we've been going through. So some of this is in the past, of course. We started in May of 2023, looking at phase 1 public survey results, then coming through and developing alternatives for basically the second half of last year, working with the city to refine our initial grouping of alternatives down to a limited list that we could then share back and pursue a second round of public outreach. Along the way there, we did have to coordinate a little bit with the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee, which took a few months of time to get through that process. And ultimately, we spoke with you earlier this year in June, right as about the time we were kicking off the phase 2 public outreach work. So since we last chatted, on the next slide here, we've got a few more milestones. If you can go to that one, John. And that included launching that public survey in August. And then as a result of that, and we'll get into the discussion of the results specifically from the community, we decided we wanted to advance the cost estimating portion of the project to get another layer of data to help with the decision-making process. So we did that in September, worked with John and John here in October on staff recommendation for the preferred alternative out of the 2 options we had on the table. And then we were planning to be back here a couple of weeks ago, and weather had a different idea. So here we are in December of 2024, presenting to you all for a second time. But we're still on track for Q1 of next year, getting through the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee to select an official preferred alternative with their guidance, and then going to a full council to support hopefully the vision that we're going to outline in our full study document. So we're just a couple months away from wrapping up the study phase of the project. And then on the next few slides here, I'm going to pass it to Janessa to talk through a review of the alternatives and some of the details there.
Yeah, so inside the next few slides, I'll be kind of summarizing the alternatives. You mentioned we've basically revisiting what we had shared back in June. And when we started the alternatives analysis, we started with the full build out section, which is essentially the city standard collector arterial section. And for this project, that would require converting the existing, on both sides of the roadway, converting the existing shoulder into bike lanes, constructing continuous sidewalk, curb and gutter, and planter on both sides of the street. And as you can see, that's obviously would require a significant amount of widening. You can see there have direct impacts to 170 plus trees, significant root impacts to 230 plus trees, and 15 plus driveways would require grades steeper than 25%. So as a team, we decided that to not be a feasible alternative to pursue due to budget, existing conditions, constraints. And with feedback from the city, we developed and advanced 2 alternatives, which are alternative 1 adds a sidewalk and a bike lane, and alternative 2 adds a sidewalk only. Starting with alternative 1, again, this adds a sidewalk along the entire length of the project, and it will be converting the existing shoulder on the west side in the northern segment of the project, which is essentially from Furwood to Upper Cemetery, into a formal traditional bike lane, as you can see in the top section. And the sidewalk in this north segment would be on the west side. South of Upper Cemetery, the sidewalk transitions to the east, which aligns with the existing sidewalk that is currently within the existing sidewalk within the project limits. This alternative also proposes a proposed crosswalk north of Upper Cemetery that will allow pedestrians to access both sides. Oh, I forgot to mention there, you can see on the bike lane continues on the west side in the south segment. For alternative 2, it proposes the same sidewalk and crossing improvements as alternative 1. However, in the north portion of the project, the sidewalk replaces the existing shoulder, so requires less section. And in the bottom section there, you can see that the south shoulder remains on the west side, and then the same sidewalk on the east. And this slide shows a perspective view of the 2 alternatives. You can zoom in, but you can see there again the sidewalk and bike lane on the west side, the north half. Bike lane continues on the west and the south, and then the sidewalk transitions to the east in the south segment. The right side perspective, alternative 2, which is the same as alternative 1 without the bike lane on the west side. And in this table, kind of presenting a quick comparison between the 2 alternatives, we start with the level of traffic stress. As you can see, for alternative 1, meet the minimum target of 3 for both pedestrians and bike level of stress. However, for alternative 2, we have a value of 4 for bikes in the uphill direction. And that little asterisk there noting that that is based on engineering judgment of uphill travel without separation from vehicles. We are to do this kind of by the book, just based on speed and volume alone. We'd have a value of 3. But physical ability does impact users' ability to access and utilize the facility. So that was kind of the factor in why we joined the 4 for level of traffic stress for bikes. Oops, sorry. And then on the bottom portion of the table there, kind of comparing, comparing with a widened section for alternative 1, you can see that would have a lot more steeper driveways than alternative 1. And the next slide also shows
The driveways are right at the sidewalk going down, touching back in the district.
yes, well, up or down, I guess.
Okay.
Both. And then again, with that widened sidewalk, the next slide, you can see the impacts to trees. Alternative 1 has almost 1.5 times more impact to trees as alternative 2. And then we also prepared planning level estimated costs. We broke these down into right-of-way design and construction. And this does include inflation. And as you can see there, the total for alternative 1 is almost twice as much as alternative 2. And mainly that's due to the higher cost needed for stormwater detention and treatment, the tree removal and mitigation requirements, And then again, with that widened section, the need for retaining walls and way in the construction.
From there, I'll chat through the survey feedback. Slide there, Joe. So we launched the survey, as we mentioned, in the summer this year, and ultimately had 290 responses to that. Very similar number to what we had during the phase 1 outreach, which we're thrilled with. A very high number for this neighborhood response. Vast majority in English, a few in Chinese. And we were asking people to evaluate these two alternatives. So we shared very similar information to what you're seeing today with the community for them to understand the trade-offs between the two different alternatives. And we asked them to evaluate 5 different categories, which are the goal statements that we had developed earlier in the study. So one of them is, are we providing equitable travel facilities? Are we improving safety? Are we expanding pedestrian access, promoting cycling, and avoiding impacts? And so we'll see those responses on the next couple of slides. We also had a few questions about use of the bike lane, whether people saw themselves taking advantage of that. And then also if they had a preferred alternative between the two options presented. So on the next slide here, we'll look at the feedback specifically for alternative number 1. And to kind of make this a straightforward concept for people to grab onto, we were asking, do you feel like the concept is getting it just right or doing too little or too much to meet that specific goal? So you see a big cluster of dots in the middle there. That's the just right portion, kind of a Goldilocks scale. And we certainly saw, more than a majority, even, closer to 60, 70%, even 80% responses in that middle column, suggesting by and large public support for alternative 1 in each of those different goal statements. There are, as we'd expect, some people that feel, either side of the spectrum there, that it did too little or too much. I'd say for alternative 1, those responses were generally pretty balanced on the kind of either end there, with one caveat, the promote cycling category, we did have a number of people voice a concern that it did too much because alternative 1 is the solution with the bike lane. So in general, kind of pretty consistent results there. And interesting, if you go to the next slide here, John, we'll see alternative 2. You still see a large cluster in that middle column of getting things just right, suggesting I think people are flexible in seeing both solutions could play out pretty well here. But you do see a larger chunk of people responding it's too little. We're not doing enough for some of the modes of travel. You see that with the equitable travel, you see that with safety, you see that with cycling in particular in these responses, which makes sense, right? We're not doing as much with alternative 2. You would expect people might voice that concern by saying it does too little. You see, similarly with alternative 2, very, very few people responding that it's doing too much for the corridor. So in terms of overall response rates, we'll get to that in a second here, but on the next slide, we do have one other question that we asked folks about the 2 different options. And this was specifically for alternative number 1. John, on the next slide, we asked if we added that alternative 1 bike lane, would you use it? Would you specifically use it? Not generally would more people use it. And we did see a majority response saying no. But we saw 40% of the people saying yes, that they personally would increase their amount of cycling activity through the area if that bike lane were added. And then on the next slide, we've got the head-to-head comparison. Which do you prefer? Alternative 1, alternative 2. Slight majority preferred alternative number 1. The difference there was 8 votes. It's a 51% to 49% score. So,
Question.
Yeah.
How many people were in that 40% that responded that they would use the bike lane?
290 responses.
You're asking of the 290, how many people actually responded to that question?
It strikes me that expect half the population to use a bike lane. So 40%, how many people are included?
I don't remember the specific number, but I remember it being, if it wasn't exactly 290, it was very close to nearly everybody responding to that question.
Okay, so 40% of 290
Yeah, and maybe it was 275. I don't have that exact figure, but it was
Over 100 people.
north of 100 people saying yes to that question.
Saying that they would increase their bike usage.
Their personal bike use. Yeah.
Putting in a survey. They would increase
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
A lot of things I've committed to within a year, obviously fall through.
Yes, but 100 people is a lot. Okay. Thanks.
I have an estimate to ask of how many people are living in this neighborhood. Do we have to ask, like the census data, you know what I mean, like what percentage of opinions were you able to capture within the residents of the area?
What was the response rate? This, sir.
So John, do you remember how many mailers we sent out? It's a pretty wide blast that we send. Yeah.
Because the question was it focused just on that? Yeah, how are
Yes.
those supposed to be? So
Right.
the responses are from that old Squak mountain.
So the travel shed for that.
Right, exactly.
How many people use that road on a daily or weekly basis? For any mode of transport?
For any mode of travel,
Is it a high usage?
no, it's not a high use corridor. No. It's a residential kind of connector route. So it's linking this neighborhood to the rest of the city, but it's not getting cut through traffic from others.
We lived in Tibbetts, or in the woods there, and our house backed up on the street, and I can tell you that street's used constantly by cars because it gets too noisy.
I walk up that street every day at the transit center. Having a sidewalk all the way up will directly improve life.
Presented these survey questions, were they also informed of the relative cost between the two solutions to frame it, or did they have no idea?
We did not frame it that way. We hadn't crunched the numbers. We knew alternative one would be more expensive, but we didn't share that.
And what's the road like before this project area and after? I've long commented on you better spend money making continuous paths than spending money in chunks that then you not gonna, if there's not a bike lane to and from it, there's less value in through it. And so what's it like before and after?
So there's no bike lane on either end.
Well, I know up to the woods, there's a bike,
Yeah.
because I've gone up to there, but I haven't gone past there, because I was just gonna catch my breath by the time I got there.
Which portion was that, John?
Oh, I went up to Furwood.
Oh, yes, okay. Right, there is a bike lane up there. There's a sidewalk on both ends. So this would be filling in a sidewalk gap. And the sidewalk is on the western side at the north end of the project, which is why our alternatives propose it connecting on the western side. And then on the south end of the project, it's on the eastern side, which is why there's a transition point midway through the project. But I don't believe there's a bike facility at the south end that we would be connecting it to.
But the transit center is only 1 block away from where this project starts, so it would be a very small additional project later on to connect the transit center to this project, which is obviously, I think the transit center is probably a large hub of bike activity because there's bike racks.
Yeah, on the north end, there's a bike lane that goes until the sidewalk stops. So it'd be continuing the uphill bike lane.
It's just the southbound direction that has the bike lane.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The northbound, just using gravity.
Hard not to go fast.
I don't know how accurate this number is anymore, but according to our neighborhood dashboard, Squak Mountain population is 4,300 or so.
Yeah, but this is a smaller area than would be considered, wouldn't it be? That would be an overestimate of,
That's the whole Squak Mountain.
yeah.
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 Squak Mountain includes communities that aren't even connected by road to this corridor, like not directly, you have to go on Sunset to get here.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
So, John, we got one more slide here. Sharing the recommendation that we worked through with city staff. Ultimately, alternative 2 was selected as the preferred alternative. Basing that on the public response, the general head-to-head number being very, very similar. And I think a big component of it was recognizing the low cost, making the alternative two a more affordable project, and potentially alternative one being too expensive to even pursue. Recognizing, of course, it's doing less, right? Everybody's acknowledging that, but you know, at this time with the city budgets, that was ultimately a very valuable indicator of what would be to come, and hopefully something that could be achieved for this corridor. So coming with that, you have fewer impacts to trees, you have fewer impacts to private persons, driveway reconstruction. That reduces complexity, makes it potentially easier to work with all the property owners along the corridor. And it leads to alternative two as the preference. John, is there anything else you wanted to add on that evaluation there?
No, that's good.
That's our question for the group. Yes.
Okay, we can start with, just some general questions, and then we can dive into. Input. Go ahead.
That's it. It's not a question.
Do we have any questions?
Any updates to the impact to trees from the storm 2 weeks ago? There were six trees impacted, 2 of which were not impacted by alternative.
The significant trees.
Yeah, the significant trees are all
Are they still
still standing.
I don't know.
It's quite possible there was a lot of trees through roofs on Squak.
I had a question about just the build outs for this, acknowledging, that the city is going to a rough, and basically everywhere in the region is going to a rough patch for a little bit with their budgets. When is this project going to be built out, and when will the budget be allocated for it?
I will reply to your question, but I don't really have an answer. So originally, the capital improvement plan showed that we would incrementally do a little bit where we design a portion of it, construct a portion of it, and keep going forward. And then with budget cuts, so we originally budgeted enough to design it with city staff, not to hire a consultant. And the position that's going to work on that design has been eliminated. So I don't know when it will get to construction. I can say that I know the community has made it known that it's a priority, but I don't have a clear answer of when we could actually implement this project.
Would any kind of funding start being rolled out like within if this particular economic or this particular budget down cycle is having around like 4 years or something like that, 3 years, then what kind of?
I think it would be challenging, and I really don't know, because it would come down to other city priorities, because this isn't a project that's going to be competing for grants. It's currently not eligible for impact fees. That's something I've been kind of toying with some of the changes to the state law. Could we have this as a project that is impact fee, but we'd have to do some changes to our concurrency update. So I guess for that wouldn't be in the next 4 years. It really would be a challenge, and it would come down to what the council wanted to prioritize, because there were a lot of cuts made. And would the council want to fund sidewalk on Squak? Would they want to fund parks back to where they were? Would they want to fund maintenance back where they were? I really don't know, but it'll be a challenging project to fund, I guess, and I don't know when.
In the near future, so.
Yeah.
Question on, you said it's not grant.
That's my same.
Grant eligible?
Yeah, it really would. Every grant I know of, it would not be a good fit, because there's not pedestrian generators. It's not in the regional growth center. It's
2 points for the grant.
yeah. When they also look at equity is a criteria. I don't think it scores as high as projects that other agencies would have. And so it's really gonna come down to the city funding it.
What increase potential bike use? Is there any kind of? Also, I don't know enough about, I should know about this, but I like, is there any kind of urban forestry component we can somehow tap into if we do option that preserves more trees? That's kind of the reach, but.
I have no idea. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, so if we think of this as like alternative 2 is sort of doing a portion of what alternative 1 is doing, they're also in conflict. So if you think about them as, you know, next year we kick off alternative 2, 30 years later, we decide we want bike lane. Maybe 30 years is the wrong time frame there, but how much of the incremental nature of this do we preserve? Like is it the whole 6 million plus 30 years of inflation that we're rebuilding the whole thing, or is it part of it preserved?
It's a good question. So there's kind of two halves to the corridor. There's the north half and the south half. In the south half, the two concepts are actually the same. We're just repurposing a shoulder to become the bike facility. So it's a reclassification of the shoulder, but it's footprint wise the same. So if you wanted to make a capital investment in just the south half, that would carry you into either alternative without changes.
What portion of the cost would that be?
I don't know if we crunched the numbers specifically that way.
We did not. The south segment is proportionately a lot shorter than the north segment.
Maybe it's a quarter of the cost.
Yeah, maybe.
Roughly.
Roughly sounds good.
And then on the north end, with projects like this where you're building sidewalk, you're building curb and gutter, it also means you're building stormwater systems. And that's the very expensive portion, usually the curb and the stormwater elements. And of course, when you build those, you have to build them kind of in their final condition unless you want to pay a lot of money to redo that down the road. So the challenge we have here is that if we build enough widening for the bike lane and we get that stormwater system into the kind of final position where it would be for alternative 1, well, then we've just built alternative 1. There's no in between. You're either putting it in the right spot or you're putting it in a place where if you wanted to come do alternative 1 later, you have to remove and rebuild that stormwater and curb system to build that extra 5 feet of widening. So the south portion has that compatibility. The north portion really doesn't. You kind of have to pick a route and stick with it, unless you want to make the big reinvestment to rebuild sometime in the future.
I have a question about construction timeline wise. I don't really want to base the whole decision off of this, but is it less time for alternative 1 or 2? Like just like time where there's potential detours or the neighborhood's inconvenienced or things like that.
It's going to be slightly more for alternative 1, but I don't think significantly more.
Yeah, I think probably it'd be a little bit more because you'd take a little longer around the driveways, but that's it. It wouldn't be significant.
Potentially negotiations with Parsons, maybe.
Yeah.
The right of way process, yeah, could take long. Again, we're talking probably on the scale of a few weeks to months, not years, extra time.
Okay.
Other questions before we dive into feedback and input? No? Okay, so anyone wants to start with feedback? Yeah, like
So first, our state has spending problem, not a budget problem. Side. So this seems like maybe the easiest thing to make a recommendation on, and maybe in the entire time I've been here. The cost difference is so substantial. And well, it's really fun to think about, oh, well, why don't we just spend a little bit more and get more? That money could be used elsewhere. Even if we're okay spending that much, it could be used elsewhere. And without having, like, you're not closing a gap with this. that money is better spent on an additional other project, if there's a decision to spend additional money, rather than just making this a single bigger project. The reason I brought up that question about, was this framed for cost, is it's very easy to have someone agree or support in favor of an option that provides more utility, and I don't dispute that it provides more utility, when there's no concept for that person that's evaluating it of the cost of that alternative. And I would guess, educated guess, but I would guess that if it was first presented the cost, and even those exact same questions were used, you'd see a major shift to the right for alternative two. Because people are aware these are tax dollars that are being used for this. And so I think you gain enough benefit, clearly just from the vote of people without even being aware of the costs. They were about split. And so it's better to invest the money in alternative two and have that money available. If we decide to spend more money, have that money available for another project to continue to build out an overall network rather than making a bigger improvement in a small area.
Yeah, I might extend that a little bit. I think I'm going to show my ignorance here a little bit. I don't know, like, if this is a good return on investment or not for either of these options. And so I'd really like to see comparison of other projects. Like, do we have other projects that produce a bike lane that's going to be used by 10 times as many people, and we're deferring funding for that, so that we can build this one? Or maybe these are really great return on investment, and as they compare to what other cities are able to do, if they're good investments. I just don't have a good feeling for that. I'd like to see more information on it. My gut feeling is that the decision to do alternative two is correct in this case. But again, I'd like to see more of that return on investment data.
I'm also leaning towards investment too. But I just don't want us to make a decision and then here the neighborhood says, hey, wait a minute, we said that we would use this bike lane if you put it in. So why did you come to that conclusion? If that's what we, it's just kind of what I'm still chewing on.
I guess since I live in the neighborhood, I think I have some perspective on this particular project, and just like, I think the sidewalk, I mean, it's a good thing that we're going with option two, and option two does include actually extending the sidewalk the whole way, because I think that is a very important step to make this area a lot less dangerous to walk around it. Because there are a lot of people who walk in this area without any sidewalk, and I think people will be more comfortable with walking if there is a sidewalk, so I think it's a good thing we're extending the sidewalk. I think the fact that building a bike lane literally doubles the cost of the project, and the fact that increases the impact massively, and the fact that we're probably, even I'm just coming at it from this perspective of like, we probably want to get this sidewalk in as quickly as possible, and adding on the bike lane with all that extra cost is probably going to mean that it takes significantly longer to put together the funding for this project. And I think getting the pedestrian infrastructure in quickly would be my priority here. Because I think the pedestrian impact, because biking on Squak Mountain is just completely impossible. Like, the hills have completely insane grades. I can't bike up Squak Mountain. Like, not, I mean, I can, but like not comfortably. Like, I don't want to. I would much prefer to walk.
Yeah, you have that 18% grade right between the ball field and the other 20%.
Yeah, exactly. It's just not feasible. Like, with electric bikes expanding, I think it would be more possible, but I think that the project, that's a problem for once electric bikes are super common, which they aren't right now.
Julian, I did
So,
have a question.
Let's do it. Cynthia,
Did you hear from the chairs?
No, I thought.
We're gonna do- we're waiting till the end.
Okay, so I also am in favor of alternative two. It's I was going through the whole presentation before I got to the cost, and I was like, of course we want more bike lanes, but that cost. And I do think that anybody who's willing to ride their bike up that, the delta between, the barrier is the grade. Yeah, exactly. The barrier is the grade and, you know, I mean, people do sometimes, I got a little confused about when you could, which the uphill, so the sidewalk is uphill on the north segment. Correct.
Yep.
Yeah, so you can get most of the way, and then if you really aren't comfortable in the traffic, you can continue on, and I believe in Washington State, you can go at will between the sidewalk and the road, and so you could. I will just say the only thing that, yeah, I mean, I agree, it just doesn't seem like a reasonable, especially, I'm not a huge fan of like voting for alternatives by people that don't have all the information, so I think that data is only somewhat useful. But I do think it's sort of air cover or just sort of like a nice way to just get a pulse check on the community. And since without information about the cost for 50/50, that does provide a data point. I think that they don't seem, and I also don't believe that 100 people are going to ride more just because it's the grade, that's the barrier. And so I am in favor of alternative 2. The only thing is I think with more and more adoption of e-bikes, that is I'm a little less clear about how that might change. But I don't think we have enough information that these people are still, you gotta write down it. People don't want to write down it. I mean, the barriers are the grade both ways. There's, it's a lot of gravity to manage going down also. So
It's scary.
right. So I'm in favor of anything that's much lower barrier just to walk.
Lived on Squak for 30 years. I know the road really well. And I used to ride up from the ramrod all the way to Fort Spring, but back in, yeah. So, the grades are pretty ferocious in the 2 main sections, but I think the cost being double and if you look 20 years down the road, there'll probably be more e-bikes are going to ride up that hill. And you go for the future e-bikes, it's going to make it easier, but biking up grade, but you won't have such a slow grading in front, biggest thing you can find at the back, going up the hill. But they're gonna be riding at a more steady pace going up. So it's not gonna be such a differential between cars and bikes. I think that would be okay in the future. It'd be nice to have a bike lane, but I think the reality of people are gonna ride the road are gonna be people that are gonna be riding with grades to that level of skill riding. I think the sidewalk, I think, is really needed. I would do so for two with the sidewalk.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like pretty much this is one of the times that we are kind of much unanimous on this alternative. I think from my perspective, it's just the entire city budget is really challenging right now for this upcoming biennial and probably for the biennial after that, and then gonna start looking at recovering right through that. And it's just a matter of trying to make a case of, this neighborhood actually will support, this neighborhood strongly supports a new sidewalk, and the funding for that is the most achievable. It would be nice again to have this bike lane up. So given the current budget cycle situation, down cycle, it's just not looking so feasible, unfortunately. So yeah, does seem like we're pretty unanimous on this. Any other thoughts?
Another question was if the non-option, will there be like the markings that you see on the road for if there is a bike, like
Like a sheriff?
Like a sheriff. Be nice to have them on the downhill.
is that an option?
About, let's take that as feedback that the tab would be interested in the Cheryl. I want to think more carefully on whether we wanted to actually mark it or not.
Okay.
But you can have it as feedback.
I don't know about other drivers, but when those are on the road, I pay attention better. I'm sure that's the point of them.
I think another Question that I don't think we fully delved into is just like the long-term aspect of this. You know, if looking down the line, you know, 20 or 25 years down the line, when you do have the light rail, and you know, people might start asking like, hey, why don't we build a bike lane as well? And so that's just one of the things I don't think we quite fleshed out here in terms of like, do we want to make that investment now so that this thing doesn't have to be revisited possibly in 20, 25 years, or are we okay with just, you know, setting that aside? Yeah.
We don't know what the neighborhood is gonna look like. I mean, you could be exactly the same old single family homes and there's no, you know, you're not gonna make a different decision in 20 years. Could be that there's a significant shift in people moving to Issaquah, even more than we predict, and you have enough population density where it makes sense to spend a lot of money. So I think it's just maybe not. We shouldn't look too much towards what our community is going to look like in 20 to 30 years. It's just a little too far out to have.
Thanks. It does feel like right now the problem is that Squak Mountain is all single family homes and it's not dense enough to actually support significant transit infrastructure, like sidewalks because people go on walks, but there's enough like people living there to require a bike lane. Like even if everybody was biking, well, if everybody was biking, then there would be enough people, but like because such a low percentage.
So it strikes me that what we've really looked at today is alternative 1 versus alternative 2. But probably what city council is going to look at is like whether to fund one of these alternatives or not, which is a slightly different question. And maybe it's just the way I approach this. But I think we think about what city council needs to make that decision. It does include more of like, is it worth it to spend $4 million on the sidewalk that we didn't really discuss in this group? So you might think about adding some more material to support that.
Well, I think that would come up when we look at the next 6-year CIP, which will happen in the spring.
Right, and there's some information missing if you're going to compare that against other projects. Like projections of how many people are going to use it, specifically how many.
I mean, I think it can just be a textual just citation of like, you know, mobility implementation plan says we want this, right? This kind of framework, and so we are, and you've said in the past, the city council has said in the past that we want, and have said in the past that we want to fill in as many sidewalk gaps as is feasible, and so that's basically the textual citation of, you know, the previous context of it.
Very true. And I guess my opinion is that the council has been made very clear by the neighborhood, their desire to have sidewalk up there. And I think that'll continue to be pushing this project up the grade with the cost pushing it down. So we're trying to get up to the top. But I think those things.
But you're really here, you're not looking for does TAB support implementing option 1 or 2? You're just looking for if the city decides to pursue something like this, which is our recommendation. That's really all you're looking for.
Mostly, if it wasn't for the current budget situation, we would probably be getting ready to design the preferred alternative done in segments, but right now I think that would be very challenging.
What else is any feedback? I think our general, our unanimous recommendation is the sidewalk only at this time. Maybe we'll revisit this 3 years down the line, but I guess we thought that that's not a consideration on our part. And so, yeah, thank you. With that, we will move on to.
Just right there, the answer to that question up there is that.
Yes.
Yes,
you agree.
yes.
For all the reasons that we cited.
Including taking a look at sheriffs.
Yeah.
Just as a suggestion
Yes.
to.
Great, okay, thank you so much, Brent and Vanessa, for presenting this. And now we'll move on to street standards landscaping.
Second.
Look at us, right on.
On time. Wait, let me ask one question.
Scaring the dust up.
Another question while we're setting stuff. I have no idea where my little name plaque went. But it's okay, I just have to, I don't know.
Sometimes they get stuck.
I think it's been a couple of meetings that I had, I just like keep forgetting to. That we're going to do all the time. I don't know if it was an open. Thank you, thanks.
You're right on. Okay. No.
Along too.
Oh, we're recruiting you. Fall 101's coming up.
All right, moving on to street standards. John and John, don't need to introduce ourselves again. So tonight we are continuing our conversation from October's meeting. We're looking to provide an overview of the landscaping standards to you and receive feedback on proposed changes. So direction needed. We showed you these questions in October. We're not going to just throw them out up there and ask you to, answer them in order. We're actually going to kind of parse them out into the different sections, the different things that we're suggesting. So just keep that in mind. And we'll go through those one by one. Okay, so I'm gonna also run through goals and impacts, sort of an overview of what we went over last time. So our goal as directed by MNI is to strike a thoughtful balance between progress and preservation. We want to keep Issaquah green, prioritizing the retention of healthy trees and protecting critical areas like wetlands. This aligns with the Climate Action Plan and our comprehensive plan, which emphasize conserving the natural environment, maintaining the forest. There's that word charm again. Forest and charm of older neighborhoods. At the same time, we aim to ensure that development supports the community's needs while minimizing its footprint on the environment. Really want to build smarter is how I look at it. On the other hand, impacts. When we make decisions about landscaping standards, we're dealing with real trade-offs. For instance, safety-only deviations for landscaping rules might sound practical. Using Squak as an example, full adherence to the street standards as currently written could mean losing nearly 180 trees, and there's those extra additional 200 root impacts as well. And that's a big environmental cost, as we talked about. It's not just about trees, it's about how these choices ripple through the community. They can affect neighbors' driveways, yards, overall look and feel of the area. Every decision we make shapes how Issaquah looks, feels, and functions for generations to come. And that's why it's so important to really get this right, to balance safety, environmental sustainability, and community impact. So let's dive in. So I will cover the first two and John will cover the second two. So first one is tree protection. Here's some of those aforementioned trees up on Squak. So the guardrails that we're looking at and considering are as follows. should we obviously want to be prioritizing native species. A question that we do want to discuss is what about those important non-native species? So our example that we talk about is, say somebody moves in to the neighborhood. It was 50 years ago. He brought with him a redwood tree. It's not native to here, but it is cool and it's big and it's nice. So, how do we address those sort of situations? Also wanting to include health and condition assessment by a certified arborist. Also thinking about the idea between prescriptive and just guidelines. So the thing that we looked at recently was City of Seattle has a list of trees. These are the trees that we save, and that's it. Versus, would we want more of like a guidelines type of structure? These are generally what we want to protect, but there's an argument to be made for X, Y, and Z. And then the final thing on this slide is sidewalk jogs versus consistency. So,
Quick question, prescriptive versus guidelines, was the guidelines, the prescriptive is narrower in scope and the guidelines is broader in scope, or how does that?
Potentially, it's potentially, I would say prescriptive is more like, almost like codified, like these are our standards, this is what we're going to do with no room to move versus.
Some ways shall or should.
Yeah.
And for this, I was thinking it would be like a list that says, okay, if it's a Douglas fir over 12-inch diameter at breast height, we save it. If it's under 12 inches, then I'm making up 12 inches for the Douglas fir. I don't know what.
Oh, across.
Yeah, the diameter, yeah. Yeah, we're gonna save only big trees. And then it might say for the western red cedar of this size, whatever that is, we work with the experts on how to do that versus having some guidelines of this is generally what we're looking for and how to do it, not to be specific and say, okay, this tree this size meets it, whereas this tree that.
How do you interpret it?
Yeah, who's just.
Well, I think it would, that's a good question. I think it would be probably the planner who would be reviewing that permit. And the guidelines would say it'd be more than I can articulate because I'm not an expert on this, but.
Does that generally increase the cost of a project meaningfully due to ambiguity versus descriptiveness?
I don't know if it would. I would say descriptive, like Shadow's very rigid, what you can and can't do.
Yeah.
And like yes or no. Where the guidelines gives you a little more flexibility as far as it's a big tree, but it's got 4 limbs on top of the same one, so it's not as valuable as another one. So you have a little better option to evaluate it based on a little more subjective as opposed to can and can't.
Could you clarify, did you mean more expensive for the project proponent or the city that has to?
I was asking both. I was initially thinking about if you are, I don't know, I wouldn't be the city developing something, but maybe Costco is doing something, right? You have to follow this. And are they gonna be spending a lot more because of like, oh, is the city gonna interpret this? Maybe we should not do this, we should do this. And they go to the city and they're like, yeah, no, other way around. And they gotta go do a redesign. So there's that side of the cost, but there's also if the city does their own projects. And so are they gonna get bogged down by this? On the other hand, I generally like the idea of guidelines because I think there's usually exceptions when you look at a specific scenario that are hard to write. You're gonna spend a ton of time trying to write for that. So that's what I'm trying to figure out the balance of.
And the only comment that I have is more of a general comment, is that you need to invest in the experience of the staff in order to have guidelines versus prescriptive. And so it is, in some ways, it could be more expensive to implement on the city's perspective to be the permit reviewer. They're gonna have that expertise. That's gonna cost money. So in order for, if it's not black and white, that person needs to be well-trained and probably well-paid to be able to it's a higher level of sophistication that costs, it can't be. So I think that's also,
We hold this discussion, I was just
Yeah.
trying to ask like what this means, but.
But I think
And
it
then
is a
come back-
pretty-
We can come back,
yeah,
let's come back to this point, yeah,
yeah.
let's come back to this.
No, great discussion. Okay, last one on this slide is sidewalk jogs versus consistency. So, there'll be circumstances where, we'll plan for the landscape strip and the sidewalk, and then we'll run into a tree, and we'll have to go around it. Versus, do we just not have a landscape strip, make it straight? There's ADA concerns, and, with having curbs in your sidewalks and whatnot around trees. So that's something else that we need to think about as well. So, as promised, 2 specific questions around the landscape strip. The tree question. Does TAB support not adding landscape strip to protect mature trees? Just yes or no. And then based on M&I's direction, the balance that I was talking about before, are these the right specific guardrails? Are we missing? Going too far,
The question on the first one, does TAB support not adding landscape strip to protect the trees? Does that mean the sidewalk and the landscape strip would continue to go around the tree, or the landscape would just stop the sidewalk around the tree and pick it up?
So it's a great question.
But we would have the sidewalk. And so, yeah, in the case like that, it would either jog or there'd be not a strip at all if we get to that question.
So not adding the sidewalk strip would protect mature trees?
It's not a sidewalk,
Well-
it's a landscape.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not having the landscape strip will protect mature trees? Or
So-
landscape strip to protect the trees?
Well, I guess the question we're asking is, this would be a deviation, because I would say that you could go around if you have room, and that wouldn't be a deviation. But if you don't have room to go around and you want a deviation, which is what we're talking about, amending the street standards is for a deviation where you'd eliminate the planter strip in order to save the tree.
In order to save the tree.
I think I may understand the geometry. Do you have a diagram of this? If not, I think I may understand. Could I sketch it to see if I am understanding the geometry correctly of what the deviation would look like?
Yeah,
There's markers down there.
I'm actually a little confused, so that.
Because I
Yeah.
know, but
Does this question even come down to, does the TAB support protecting mature trees? Seems to be-
yeah, okay, I guess.
So we hate trees.
So-
I think
True.
cost kind of here is if there's a tree,
That's fine.
this is the landscape strip.
Yeah.
And this is the sidewalk, and what we would be doing is this.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's, I assumed so, and it seemed like there was some confusion. So just-
Is there a few other-
Because, and I should have mentioned this in the introduction that I gave. I mentioned in October, the only deviation that we are allowed to grant, I guess, to not have a landscape strip is safety, and that's all. So that's why we're looking at all these different categories to see.
I think a lot of what makes Washington, Issaquah especially, such a beautiful place is the trees right now.
Oh, sorry, trees, yes.
And landscape.
It's the trees.
Yeah.
5 feet.
It's like, where else do you get that? You have these like huge trees. So it seems like that's the sort of thing we would want exceptions for. Of course, if the tree is a risk for other reasons, then
Yeah.
cut it down right away. Fourfold one.
Yeah, and, yeah, what we're really wanting to know is, because there are benefits to having that landscape planter strip. And so if you're on a sidewalk and you have a planter strip, it's a lot more pleasant to be walking than if you're on a sidewalk next to all the cars zipping by you. But then it comes down to the trade-off of, it's a slightly worse experience for the pedestrian to be next to the street, but as Mike, as you just said, I mean, look at those trees like up on Squak that are still standing, hopefully.
Some of them are.
Yes.
I can confirm.
That is why people, especially in that neighborhood, that's why people live there, are the trees.
It's not for the bike lane, sorry.
Pain of that now.
I have a question. I want to make sure that we're talking about exactly the same thing, because if I look at the language in bullet 2 and I look at that diagram, they're not identical. Because what that says is that supports not adding a landscape strip. So that means that the hashed area wouldn't exist. So I want to make sure that we're not opening it up so great
Actually,
that.
can you go back sorry for interrupting.
For sure.
But you can vary the
Because
last.
I thought that was like your jogging area, so that was.
That's one of the things we do want to talk about, because it is either.
Apologies to the people online who can't see the whiteboard.
Oh, yeah,
We should take,
true. But so,
for open event, should we take a picture of that or doesn't matter? Just so that the public knows.
There we go.
If you talk, I bet it'll.
okay, so. See if they count. I make.
Maybe a little too wide.
We could always move it in
Yeah.
front of the camera. That's important, just to document.
Okay, so when we get to the part of jogs versus consistency, here's jogs. And probably wouldn't be gradual, it'd be more abrupt versus consistent. And so under the situation where you'd have jogs, you have planter strip, and then when you get to the tree that you're trying to preserve, you move it in. So it's going in now versus the consistency. And so that's one of the things we do want to ask. And Mike.
So in this drawing, the road would be on
Yeah,
the top, and so the strip is to push the sidewalk away from the road. Landscape strip.
Yes.
yeah,
And so if you, either of these situations, you're leaving.
yes.
Just whether you're getting the sidewalk.
Well, leaving the tree, if you answer the question, yes, we want to leave the tree. So I guess go to the next slide. So the first question is, do we want to consider eliminating this to preserve this tree? And then the second question is going through the different things where we talk about, okay, we said we want to save the tree. Now, how do we want the sidewalk to be where we're saving the tree?
Sorry, can I go back to my previous question before you jump on that? I just want to say, are we talking about eliminating for just the span where the tree is? We're talking about eliminating it altogether because there's a tree somewhere in that span. That's the part I just don't want it to be.
That's what we really want to get into, is that jogs versus consistency.
That's
So,
not.
so the initial question really is supposed to be, does TAB support variances or modifications to the standard to protect mature trees?
Yes,
That's
that's
like
a
the
good way to
initial
put it.
question. And
Yes.
I can't imagine, but I don't want to speak for everyone.
I mean, it's a no-brainer.
Yes.
So,
Yes, we support that.
so then the follow-up question is,
Yeah.
what the specific types of variants? Yes.
Which are,
Yeah, so I think your question is actually the same as, do we do jogs or do we do consistent sidewalks that are always next to the street?
It's the only way you get to that alternative. That makes sense. Okay, I'm on Team John.
Does jog, so I get that moving away from the street provides comfort. And for people that are choosing to, ride on a sidewalk, that may be like added comfort. But a jog could also be a negative because you'd have to slow down and navigate around a tree and people. So how does that?
I think we can tie in not to add, I guess, to add in another factor. This is prescriptive versus the guidelines and what we think about that as well, if that makes sense, right? Because those two questions are very closely related. Because if we do the guideline aspect, then we provide the planner with some discretion when it comes to this, right? um, versus prescriptive, there's not some discretion on this other issue. I think this prescriptive versus guidelines might be the underlying issue of this as well.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, and actually, when we talk about these, I do have some probing questions that you want to ask the tab. But I want to see if we can just start from the top and work our way down to the bottom and then get to the final two, which I think would be the meat of the discussion. And so I assume,
Before we do that, I'm sorry to interrupt. Are we inventing something new here, or is this something that other cities have done? And we can just kind of adopt frameworks that already exist and try to test it?
I really didn't, I spent a little bit of time looking at different cities and their standards. I didn't see a whole lot of guidance. I think most cities, if they had something like Squak, even if their standard would be to put in a planner script, would say, no, we're not. But we're really trying to follow our own standards that we would have for private development. And so that's why we're really wanting to look at what our standards say, and it would apply for both private development and public development. But yeah, I couldn't find, not that I've read every street standard in the state, but I looked at,
Why limit it to the state? I mean, this could be anywhere in the world, could have a similar situation.
right, I didn't find it, but I didn't look everywhere. And so I guess, what question, is everyone okay prioritizing native species? And next question, important non-native species.
I don't,
What's classified?
yeah.
So,
I need to
like, think of when pioneers settled Issaquah. A lot of times they would move from wherever they came from and they would bring the important tree. And so there are trees in Issaquah that are not native to Issaquah that have a long history with Issaquah. And so you might have a tree that a homestead planted.
So is it species or trees then, the second one?
Um,
Because you're describing like, well, there's a specific tree because that tree is a
Oh,
tree.
yeah, I don't know of examples. We met with Dan Hines, who's the city's tree expert in the Parks Department. And he said that there are instances when we have important non-native species. And so the example I came.
Specimens of non-native species, so specific trees
Oh.
of non-native.
Right.
And I want to clarify that, right? Is this about, so like, I mean, for me, there's a historical tree, absolutely protect them, right? Is this meant to be more of well, any tree of that species that there's some historical tree, any tree of that species, we would consider important. So,
Big tree.
yeah, so is this really important non-native specific trees? That is the question.
Yeah, like specimens.
Well, so the Seattle list actually does list specific species of non-native trees that they prioritize to protect. So that's where we did come up with it. And then Dan had mentioned things like homesteads, and the example I thought of is near where I live. There's a coastal redwood tree. Now, it's not native to Washington, but I love redwood trees. And I would hate to see this redwood tree cut down for a planter strip. And so I'm asking the question to you all, is that something that should be considered to protect?
I think, yeah.
It's gonna be a mix of protect this specific tree because it's special, and protect the species because we want them, more of them. Like all of these questions are gonna come down to how do we specify them in guidelines or, prescriptively, do we enumerate every tree? So whatever we end up coming up with for that, to summarize it as like, should we protect native species or non-native species? We're gonna be missing a lot of the nuances that show up in whatever guideline is created by an expert. So it's really difficult for us to provide a lot of useful feedback. I agree. It's gonna lead to good guidance.
I guess the one thing that I want us to all keep in mind here is that we're talking about like which things cause pedestrians have the most comfort while walking, and shade is one of the most important things, especially in the summer, for pedestrian comfort while walking. And for that reason, like, I think that any species, whether native or non-native, that is providing large amounts of shade to the sidewalk, that should probably be a consideration. That's just as a recommendation, that should be a consideration for whether or not it should be prioritized, because that is one of the most important things today.
I guess I would add a category there, which is historical trees. Like you cannot, there's no replacing it. There's no, this is another one. The one thing I would note on all the trees is some trees are known to live a certain lifespan, which is a little different than an arborist saying it's not healthy. So if a tree is known to live a certain lifespan and it's a very old tree that's not likely to live much longer, that may be different. I don't think we need to get into that level of nuance, but when it comes to ISA certified, that's part of what they should be assessing, is not just the health and condition, but lifespan. Maybe they consider condition part of that.
Yeah, if you cut down a big poplar, maybe you're cutting 10 years off its life, but a big oak, that could be hundreds of years.
Like the cottonwood trees that just fall down.
Yeah,
Like we-
related to poplar.
Or beet trees.
Yeah.
I have a question or something also to chew on, like adding yet another layer to this, but, are there like culturally modified trees, like trees of significance to like the local tribes? I don't know what the consultation looks like with that. I know that's gonna be largely fall under like native species and we're prioritizing that in the first place. But I know there was like, I didn't follow up on it, but that was a big, some pensions there in Seattle about cutting down culturally modified tree or not. Just another layer. Yeah, to this.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Quick time check. I think since we're doing like how many categories left, doing 5, so start pushing through this.
This one.
Wrap this up.
Yeah, I would say if we can also divide it up. To me, getting the information for the trees is most important because it really ties into Squak. And I'd say my next biggest priority would be the critical areas. And then the other two things I think could wait till January. Because I'd rather have get meaningful feedback on the trees. That's my highest priority.
I'm concerned of non-native species as opposed to more Pacific country. That would be, I'm not sure what anything the species can be protected, whether it's good or bad. Maybe it's an area that's going in for a specific tree. It's too broad. Non-native.
Okay, and then I assume everyone's okay with making sure that as part of it, the deviation request that an arborist should prepare a report and.
Yeah.
Okay, so now the prescriptive versus guidelines and a sub category of that, jogs versus consistency.
I'm just trying to think about like there's a general framework. If we lean towards guidelines, do we lean therefore towards dogs? If we lean towards cryptic, do we lean towards consistency? How is that mapping?
It could go either way because you could say it is very prescriptive and you will, if you apply for this deviation, every time you're past the tree, you have the planter strip back. And you could end up with a lot of jobs and that could be how it could be. Or you could say, go with prescriptive and, or not prescriptive guidelines and have it differently. I think there's pros and cons to both.
So are jogs really disruptive to people with disabilities or like what? I mean, I feel like when you're walking, most people understand why you might need to JD jog around a special tree. So I'm kind of more inclined towards promoting jogs to say big trees and to keep planter strips so that 90% of your walking experience, you're away from the cars. So, but I'm wondering what other people think, and I'm wondering if I'm missing some important information about what the experience is to
On,
jog around.
on the walking experience, sometimes the routes, well.
That's a different matter.
That's-
Route upheaval is a huge
That's-
issue.
it's a
Yeah,
huge issue, but it's a different matter.
it is a different
So
matter.
that's like one of the main things about, just like even accessibility, right? It's a totally different matter. It's nothing to do with this necessarily, so jogs are relatively frequent, I would say, just. So,
It seems to come down to whether we're okay throwing out the landscape strips, in cases where we don't necessarily need to. And so like the original purpose of the landscape strip still holds. And so are we going with consistency? Are we thinking that's a better aesthetic than putting a jog in?
Well,
Because I don't think that.
Yeah, I'm saying we're not throwing it out, we're just, if there's something we want to say, we're gonna jog. I mean, we're not gonna have a sidewalk that's gonna have. jog.
Yeah, there's not necessarily a cost to, putting in a jog over using a sidewalk next to the street.
That's expensive.
It might be that it's
Same
not
across the sidewalk, not have landscapes, but to come in and come back out.
Yeah, I think this almost comes down to like, do we want to preserve as much of the street standards as possible?
Yeah.
Or are we missing some of
The
the
jog preserves it more though, right?
I think the jog preserves it more.
Well, we're not interested in preserving the code, we're interested in preserving the experience.
Yeah, that's what the street
Okay.
standards are supposed to.
Right, but I mean, I guess
So we're talking a lot about experience, but it's a sidewalk. You're not like experiencing
Oh, yeah.
the world. I mean, you're walking on a sidewalk to get somewhere and there's a tree there. And there's-
well, I mean, it does have a lot to do with the pedestrian experience is definitely a consideration, I think, that we should talk about, because there is a remarkable difference of walking along the road, which has a few feet of separation, a couple of feet of separation with you against, like, the traffic versus having to walk up straight. Yes, now, if you want to decide how you want to, increase the width of sidewalks, so that people can walk, have a little more space to walk on the other side, but that's not up for discussion today, but, thinking about the landscape, that the protection that it offers, just psychological protection and also physical protection.
Oh, I'm all for the landscaping part. It's just when we get to a tree. I mean, I don't think a big deal is. I mean, you get a tree, you go around the tree and you're back.
Right, I agree. I agree.
So the question I have is, let's say you have a corridor with a lot of trees, and how many jogs? Like, are you gonna jog around every single tree, or do you take a corridor and you say, well, there's gonna be jogs the whole way, or we just eliminate the planter strip?
So. Well, I was, strange analogy maybe, but 3D printing, this thing, limit the number of retractions in a given length. Too many in a given length, the extrusion causes jam. And it almost seems like you just need some sort of really basic guideline about this many jogs per quarter mile or something is the limit. Just so like a really, it probably is not going to be an issue that often, but just put something in place, because I think we all would go, well, you don't want to go like this. So figure out what's a reasonable within a quarter mile or a half mile, whatever the standard would be, and just throw that in there. But I'm hearing everyone say we're going to support a jog.
When the trees are 40 feet apart, jog.
But
We're
I'm
closer than that now.
you have a section like that, it's gonna be very rare that you can have one section that's gonna have that. So you're gonna design the street a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Let's say most of the streets, you might have a jog occasionally. But if you're gonna have a street where there's a lot of, like a big section, well, maybe redesign the street a little bit and go for. Have a little bit more of a straight section through there, actually not jogging. That would be just kind of part of the engineering. As you go through, you look at that particular section on that particular street. I mean, I see this is not every street's gonna have dogs all the time. It's a rarity that you can have. It's a rarity that you can have a bunch. Oh, it's not that much of a rarity that you may have occasional dogs. Make sense?
Yeah, I think we all are kind of on the same page. I just want to make sure the code isn't written in such a way that it needs to be crafted in a way that someone doesn't use this as a way to get around the landscape strip. That's what I'm worried about.
And that was the worry of council.
So if there's one jog, then boom, you've got, now you don't have that separation, because I do think that separation is important. So I think it's just gonna come down to the details of the way the code is crafted. The guideline, which I guess would be better.
So is what we're talking about, is that kind of tied into where the code is going then, and as part of our input into it?
Yes, so the input from you all will go into proposed revision. And trying to, if we go the route that has been suggested, and I'm just gonna say X jogs every quarter mile, find what's reasonable, whether it's a quarter mile or every 100 feet or however we want to define it. Come up with something if that is the direction the town wants to go. So that way, what we don't want to do is just open it up. We're like, hey, look, we can develop our frontage for less money and save. And the city does not get what the city wants.
Yeah.
But also trying to come up.
Developing some guideline of like, not to the zigzagging.
Right.
Quarter mile.
Yeah, and then thinking of Squak. So depending on what the input that goes into revising the street standards, there probably will be sections of Squak that will have a planter strip, because there are sections where we don't have driveways, where we don't have trees that we're trying to protect. And so then there would be a planter strip there.
I think this is. I think we're good on this. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move to critical.
All right, critical areas. So we changed the title of this one, but in October's presentation, it was just wetlands, but we decided that, not all critical areas are wetlands. So these include geologically hazardous areas, wetlands, fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, critical aquifer recharge areas, and streams. To touch on mitigation sequencing, so basically there's a hierarchy of when you're approaching a project in a critical area or around a critical area, going from top to bottom is the order in which you try to mitigate potential issues and impacts on said critical areas. So at the top, if you can avoid messing with it, avoid it. If you can't avoid, minimize the impacts as much as possible. If you can't minimize all the impacts, you can rectify the impacts of making sure that gets fixed or addressed. There's also compensate for the impacts, which means basically, for example, I believe Costco was built partially on wetland. They moved some wetland over. So that's the compensation is physical space. And then finally, monitoring the impact and potential compensation if monetary compensation is required. So the critical area guardrails that we're thinking about is planter strip reduction deviations approved for wetlands and streams. Full stop, we'll do that. For the other ones, they would be evaluated with the critical area report and be determined on a case-by-case basis based on the report. So our question to you, similar as before, does TAP support not adding a landscape strip to protect critical areas as part of mitigation sequencing? And are these the right guardrails?
Any questions on this? No?
I-
Comments?
I do have
Yeah.
a question on, so like the critical areas, the things that fall under that category, like what percentage of town is that? Because there's streams all over, we've got crazy hillsides. Costco was built on a wetland evidently, so like, I guess, I like percentage wise of what this would affect is.
about that.
So I'll say streams and wetlands. I don't think it would be that often. Because usually you'd be impacting a buffer to one of those. But like, there are times when it's the picture on the right, it's Newport Way right next, I think it's Newport Way, right next to a wetland. So that would be an example. It took a little bit of looking at the map to find where we'd have that. Where we also might have that is with the central Issaquah grid, because there's a lot of wetlands on the valley floor. And there might be a situation where there's a wetland near where a new street needs to go in. I have not pulled up the wetland map and compared it to the future street grid. I think streams would also be not too often. I think maybe 221st as you go from the roundabout at 62nd towards the north and top of time. That, yeah, the creek gets pretty close there. And if there was a sidewalk, I think the only way you could really construct a sidewalk there would be to relocate the creek. In my conversations with the planners, they said you don't want to have to relocate streams, but we have done it before. But that's something that we do want to try and not do.
On the picture that you just had up here, for example, if we were gonna add a sidewalk to the picture on the left, we won't want to include plastic, we make it a narrow 5-foot sidewalk.
Right. Yeah, and in that case, might even say, no, we're not putting the sidewalk on that side. But yeah, we'd want to avoid and minimize as much as possible.
Sorry, are we talking about the taco time closer to Gilman or?
Oh, the north Issaquah taco time.
Yeah.
Near Brown Bear. All right, well, I guess there's now brown bears on both sides.
Okay.
Any,
Great place.
any comments on this?
I feel like, well, just knowing nothing. Yeah, it makes no sense to add a landscape strip where we would otherwise preserve a wetland. But I know like it's more nuanced than that, but just in case we don't say it, I'm just gonna say that.
I think you put on a wetland sign helpful to the water for kids.
Yeah, it's one thing to live in nature, it's another thing to live, knowing someone built nature somewhere else, you could not have nature here. That's why when you're doing your moving this, it's like, oh, we cut down the forest here, planted it 500 miles away, but there's still forest. It's like, I don't know, it seems like this is another one of those, like, well, of course we would want to have a deviation for this. I'm almost surprised that we don't want to have a way to do that.
Yeah, well, because you're replacing, a biodiverse area that is full of life with grass, which is just a monoculture. And it seems patently ridiculous to do that, but there are obviously there's like pedestrian benefits. And I think that the concern here again is that we don't want this to become a thing where you can just use it to ignore the landscaping requirements. Because if too much of the town has wetland, then if developers are just like, well, there's a wetland, so we don't have to do the landscaping, that's not helping us achieve our goals.
Yeah, no, it's not too widespread. And I spent a lot of, the reason why this got so revised is I met with the planner in the community planning and development who specializes in review of critical areas and really got at, okay, what do we really need to protect? And that's when he said streams and wetlands. And originally we were looking at the difference between a category 1 and 2 wetlands versus 3 and 4, with 1 and 2 being higher value wetlands. But then we looked back at the code and the code does not differentiate between the different, like, it doesn't say to mitigate, do your mitigation sequencing different based on the category of wetlands. So we said, okay, to be consistent with the code, if it's a wetland, then we're going to allow a deviation to avoid a direct impact of the wetland. And then if it's a buffer, then it would really be the critical area report that would look at the nuances, the benefits of the buffer, and could compare the benefits to the pedestrian and the deviation request, and get into the best science.
The angle,
Should we be looking at other alternatives like trails instead of sidewalks for wetlands? Things that are more friendly and still provide connectivity with all the benefits that we would want from the landscaping standards.
I'm gonna say no, and the reason why is when we put in a sidewalk, it needs to be accessible to people with disabilities. And if, I mean,
We can't do that with trails.
correct. Not in the public right of way. Because in the public right of way, it would not meet the disability standard. Or accessibility standards, I should say.
the angle I'm thinking about the second environmental side is the issue of permeability. And when they're doing that, grass strip with hands up permeability, even somewhat. And so you would have at least a little bit of permeability in the driveway or it goes to wetland. Is there anything, what does the engineering say about that?
Well, I think it would be a wash because if you're, yeah, it's either between the sidewalk and the street, or it's between the sidewalk and the wetland.
Generally, it sounds like our opinion is we should have some level of deviation allowed.
I think that for general consensus, and, yeah, but I think we did express like, preoccupation about whether, again, like, that can't be used just too arbitrarily. But it sounds like that, the areas that this would be over isn't that much.
Right.
So that concern might be somewhat alleviated, hopefully.
Yeah.
Amongst us.
I would even say this is more of consistency with, or lining up the street standards with the environmental regulations for the city.
Cool. I think in that case, we're generally consensus about this issue. In terms of supporting not adding landscapes to connect local areas. And the guardrails, everyone thinks the guardrails look good as well. Cool. I think we see 747. Do you think we get into another next rehab one?
I think we,
Or
let's just wait till January.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Cool, well, we will come back to this in January. Thank you so much. Okay, moving on, reports and board work plan.
You need to do you need to do a new work plan.
I know, I was actually talking to Emily about that. Thinking about that, but we got something for January.
Okay, and then staff reports.
Nothing besides this is my last tab on staff. Yeah. Which is sad, but I'm excited for the next thing.
It's been really great working with you.
Yeah, same for all. I'm gonna miss you all. I love these discussions.
Will you be working on squat projects?
I think Brent seemed to indicate maybe, so it would make sense. It
Can I
would
come
be a
back?
nice.
Guest appearance.
Yeah, I know. The people, but I'm gonna laugh when I go to council. So now, but yeah, that's all I have.
I'll add, we've had some success getting some grants recently, and so we'll be able to do some great projects for the community. We recently got a grant to improve or do an enhanced crosswalk of East Sunset Way at 6th. at the trailhead. That's something that the community's been asking for a very long. Yes, and so as part of the design, we're gonna evaluate, do we want RFBs, do we want a pedestrian hybrid beacon? But that's something we will get going on.
Hybrid beacon.
Yeah, it's one where it'll show a red for cars to stop. And then at a certain point, I think it blinks, so that way, if no one's in it, the cars can go. Originally, we were just asking for an RFB, and then washed out when we applied for the grant. They said, hey, you want extra money and consider a pedestrian hybrid beacon? And if you don't, like if the community engagement and engineering says not to put that in, just don't spend it. So that was a win.
Like a hotel upgrade.
Yeah, I know. And then we also got with the same grant competition, got grant to add an RRFB at Second and Evans, which is really close to. Thank you. I should have just assumed everyone knows that. Rectangular rapid flashing beacon. So when you have those, yeah, so when you have the crosswalks with those lights that flash, that's what an RRFB, or rectangular rapid flashing beacon.
It's not really rapid, unfortunately.
I know it's not as rapid.
So the Second and Evans, that's a major pedestrian route to the middle school and high school. And it's lots of pedestrians use it. And so we'll be enhancing that crosswalk. We also got a grant from the state to purchase video equipment to do video analytics at traffic signals to analyze for safety, which is something that came out of the ITS plan. And so that's something I'm really looking forward to, our ability to get that done. And then we also, just before Thanksgiving, we're notified that we were given a complete streets grant to improve the crosswalk of Front Street at Bush. That's right now, it's got a little pedestrian island that keeps getting hit by cars. And we will put in a rectangular rapid flashing beacon and move the crossing a little bit, so that way turning cars won't hit it anymore.
Oh, that's right, by the pool.
Yes, yep,
That's that's not.
yes. So we'll be improving that crossing as well. So
I heard that.
don't tell Ben. Ben is the one who has to replace the.
Sounds like a great grant, Paul.
Yeah.
Sounds great. Amazing job.
Thanks.
Okay. Anything else from staff?
No.
No chair reports. You have the.
I don't know about you.
Actually, no, not you. It's not here. It's not here. Any other business announcements? No, okay. In that case, we are adjourned. That's it.
I am the youngest person in the room right